The rescue and escape attempts of the imperial Russian family in 1917 and 1918 are scattered and unknown. We can glean some through the research done by Helen Rappaport in her book The Last Days of the Romanovs. We can also glean some through the actions of Grand Duchess Olga, the most serious of the last Romanov daughters, who made multiple attempts to look over the fence surrounding the house of special purpose in Ekaterinburg, where she would ultimately meet her death. From her mother, the Tsarina Alexandra, gesturing to passers-by from a window in 1917, to her youngest sister, Grand Duchess Anastasia, moving her head back and forth in front of a light in a sort of Morse code by a window, whether purposeful or not, the imperial family seemed to believe someone would save them. But no one did. Let's comb through the rescue and escape attempts of the last Russian royal family. Dmitry Shakbagov, or Mitya, was one of Grand Duchess Olga's favorite soldiers, whom she met in 1915 while volunteering as a nurse for the Red Cross during World War I. The two remained in contact even after Mitya left the infirmary. In December 1916, Grand Duchess Olga noted in her diary that Mitya received the second company of the battalion recruits. He is happy. Mitya did not forget his friends in Tsarskoye Selo. He regularly corresponded with them, mainly through V.A. Vilchkovskaya, known as Bibi. The last time the two young people saw each other was at Christmas 1916, the last Christmas of Imperial Russia, while the recent murder of Rasputin darkened the holiday for the Romanov family, which you can learn about on this channel. These were very anxious weeks, and they had their last goodbye under the Christmas tree. Mitya was going away to his noble regiment. Apparently, the last mention of him in the diary of Olga was made on his birthday, February 9th, 1917. Today, Mitya turned 24. May God save him. Apparently, they never saw each other again after December 27th, 1916. However, Shakbagov was still fated to meet with the father of Grand Duchess Olga one more time. According to the memoirs of the captain of the Yerevan Regiment, at the end of February 1917, two companies of military staff were sent to Petrograd to suppress unrest. Also heading there was the Adjutant General and Chief Lieutenant Dmitry Shakbagov. The echelon already on its way met up with the Emperor's train at one of the stations, an infamous trap. His Majesty greeted the troops, and having learned there was a detachment going to Petrograd to suppress riots, personally ordered them to turn back, which was done. If they had proceeded, could the Romanovs have lived longer? In June 1917, Shakbagov left his regiment like many of his comrades who had no loyalty to the provisional government. The entire Russian army had been named the godfather to the Tsarevich Alexei upon his birth, and so they took their loyalty seriously, at least some of them did. It is unknown where Mitya went at that time, but he and Olga sometimes managed to get news about each other, in letters smuggled into exile by various servants and friends to the crown. What are Mitya and Volodoya up to? Asked Grand Duchess Tatiana in her letter to Chebotareva from house arrest at the Alexander Palace. There was also a mention in a letter Grand Duchess Olga wrote from Tobolsk. Kupov wrote a letter. He saw Mitya and Boris in Petrograd. They sent us regards. This is from mid-April 1918. What was he doing in Petrograd? You can learn more about this specifically in the Grand Duchess Olga Mitya videos on this channel. Opportunities to escape were especially dangerous since the communists infiltrated various branches of the Russian government for decades by 1917. The Okhrana, the secret police force of the Russian Empire, hired Jewish lawyers and Zionist communist informants who regularly assassinated Russian politicians, such as Prime Minister Stolypin. With these layers of traitors, trusting anyone became very difficult, even during peacetime. Let's dive into some of the rescue attempts outlined by Helen Rappaport in her book, in this look at July 1918. For 6 weeks from July 11th, 1918, the devoted sisters of the Novochovinsky convent in Ekaterinburg made their way from the southern outskirts of the city to the Ipatiev house, bringing food, eggs, flour, cream, milk, butter for the Romanov family. They had never been allowed into the house but had to deliver their goods to the commandant at the front door. Although they found the experience intimidating, they would not abandon their little father, Batyushka Tsar. The convent had a long and eminent reputation for philanthropy. Established in the late 18th century, it had since 1822 been one of the wealthiest in Russia, with a complex containing 8 churches set in a landscaped park with ponds, a hospital, almshouse, orphanage for girls, and high quality of handicrafts produced by its 900 sisters were famous: candles, painting, needlework, and embroidery. Sister Agnes, mistress of the novices who undertook the daily trip to the Ipatiev house, instructed them to go in civilian dress, this being acceptable as they had not yet taken their vows, in order not to antagonize the Bolshevik guards, who were usually very non-Christian, who otherwise derided them for their black nuns' habits. Before his dismissal, the guard Avdiv regularly helped himself to the vast majority of the food, sharing it with his favorites. It was only after he was gone that Tsar Nicholas discovered it was being pilfered, yet the pilfering still went on. Yurovsky kept the Romanovs waiting for their morning inspection as he sat and tucked into the cheese brought by the nuns. He recently told the family they would not be getting any more cream from the convent. Their meat ration was being drastically reduced, too. The latest delivery, supposedly for 6 days, was, complained the Tsarina, barely enough for soup. After the morning inspection, 3 workmen arrived and began installing a heavy iron grating in front of the only window in the Tsar and Tsarina's corner bedroom. This seemed yet another indicator of the tightening of the regime at the house under Yurovsky, a man whom the Tsarina called the ox or the bull. The Tsar was on his guard too. We liked the man less and less, he confided to his diary. The installation of the iron grill had no doubt come about because, despite the high double palisade fence, the Tsarina had been spotted by the external guards standing too close to an open window, trying to catch the attention of people in the large cobbled plaza opposite. Yurovsky warned her not to do this, but she ignored him. The nervousness of the guards at any attempt by the Romanovs to signal to the people in the world outside intensified since the change of regime at the house. The place seemed impregnable, but there was still the threat of attack or even rescue. Back in June 1918, Avdiv was alerted they might need to evacuate the family due to rumors of a possible attack from anarchist extremists. Their intention, though Avdiv did not reveal this, was to murder the family. The Romanovs were told to pack and be ready to leave, but a few days later the threat receded. Then had come the discovery only a week or so after that, at the end of June, of a smuggled letter concealed inside the large cork stopper of a bottle of cream brought by the nuns. It was Dr. Derivenko who had first requested the family be given access to food from the convent, and their daily delivery had inevitably been made clever use of, with messages for the family hidden in loaves of bread or scribbled on the paper in which food was wrapped. The doctor at some point had been involved as an important go-between in serious plans to try and stage a rescue of the family, but he himself could not have passed notes to the family, because he was very closely watched when he came to the house to treat the Tsarevich. Colonel Ivan Sudorov, one of the Tsar's former adjutants, had sought the doctor out in Ekaterinburg in mid-June, after traveling north from Odessa, and through him made contact with the nuns of the Tikhvinsky convent, getting them to smuggle in notes. It is not known whether Sidorov or some other group of loyalists was responsible for the letter in the cream received around the 20th of June, but Avdiv spotted it and handed it over to the Cheka, the Soviet police. The letter purported to come from a group of monarchists in the city, no doubt one of several, who had taken rooms in local hotels and rooming houses under false names, where they hatched various plots, singly and in groups, as they tried to find ways of contacting the imperial family. Some of them had the bravado to go and stand outside the Ipatiev house, or send in letters and gifts, all of which were confiscated. One plot by Oliver Locker Lamson of the British Royal Naval Armoured Car Division was where he was sent into Russia to assist the Imperial Army in 1916. He had gotten to know the Tsar at Mogilev, and after the confinement at Tsarskoye Selo, he deemed the opportunities for rescue very easy. He bribed the already careless guards with cigarettes, vodka, and British bully beef. Lamson planned that one of the Tsar's servants would don a false beard and cloak and take his place, so then the Tsar could disguise himself in a British khaki uniform that Lamson smuggled in, shaved off his beard, and walked out of the palace in front of the drunken guards. That was the plan. From there, a field ambulance would take him to a military train north to Archangel and a British ship to the UK. The same ploy could not be used with Alexandra and the children. The Tsar refused point blank to be rescued until they could be saved, too, proving himself in Lamson's eyes a true king and a true man. The real window of opportunity for escape, had there ever been one, had been in the first 2 weeks of the imperial family's confinement at the busy Tsarskoye Selo in March 1917. And this has also been remarked upon by Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna the Younger in her memoirs. This was the convinced view of British military attaché General Walscourt Waters, who at the time told the War Office if a fast torpedo boat and a few bags of British sovereigns could be promptly dispatched to the Gulf of Finland, there was a good prospect of rescue. But it had to be the entire family, even where the opportunities for rescue presented themselves at Tobolsk. Any attempt at flight would probably have been vetoed in the end by the Tsar and Tsarina because of Alexei's fragile state of health and cases of measles among the girls. Nevertheless, in Tobolsk, members of the imperial entourage had free passage in and out of the governor's house, facilitating the passing of plans and messages and enlisting of the support of a powerful church leader, Bishop Hermogen of Tobolsk, as well as Petrograd supporters of Rasputin's former circle. The Tsar's aides, Count Taditchev and Prince Dolgorukov, had been in communication with an envoy sent to Tobolsk by monarchists of a national center group, which was a secret organization of anti-Bolsheviks led by right-center politicians. They passed on money to assist in the escape. Other loyalists put their trust in a Russian of dubious character named Boris Solovev. Son of the treasurer of the Holy Synod and a follower of the globalist satanic mystic Madame Blavatsky, he married Rasputin's daughter Maria in 1917, in a cynical move designed to curry favor with the monarchists. He then assumed command of a rescue plan based at nearby Tyumen. He managed to get notes through to the Tsarita in Tobolsk, perhaps using his connection with Rasputin to do so, and she approved a rescue plan fronted by Solovev and his supposed 300 officers of the Brotherhood of St. John of Tobolsk. Considerable amounts of money were needed, claimed Solovev, to fund the rescue, and these had been raised by means of consignment of the Tsarina's jewels smuggled out of the governor's house. But not everyone trusted Solovev or his motives, and when his rescue plan failed to materialize, people started asking questions about where the money went and whose aid he was on. The Tsars, the Germans, or the Bolsheviks. The constant fundraising drained people who would have been happy to help the Tsar and Tsarina escape otherwise as well. Was this whole rescue plan bogus, an act of simple greed, or the first of several orchestrated attempts at deliberate provocation by the Bolsheviks to unsettle and undermine the Romanovs? In Simbirsk, in early July 1918, another rescue plot was hatched by a Serbian officer, Lieutenant Kapel, who held a secret meeting at the Hotel Troitsa Spaskaya with Russian monarchists and former members of the Duma. They had at their disposal, allegedly, plans of the Ipatiev house drawn by the Tsar and smuggled out to Dr. Derivenko, who was supposedly cooperating with them in a rescue plan set for July 15th. Kapel dispatched a monarchist captain from the Urals, Stepanov, back to Ekaterinburg to prepare plans to storm the Ipatiev house by night, with a commando-style group of local officers with the assistance of undercover Czech officers from their legion, having first created diversions in nearby towns such as Perm. But the Ekaterinburg Cheka, by now only too well of monarchist plots, arrested Stepanov as soon as he had stepped off the train, so even among the monarchist groups there were spies. Another highly implausible plot hatched in Kiev by a former member of the imperial entourage, Alexander Mosolov, Prince Kochubey, and the German Duke, George of Lichtenberg, had favored spiriting the Romanovs away to Berlin. A reconnaissance party would go on to set up a base in Ekaterinburg for the family's rescue. Two officers had been sent into the city as scouts, where they were to make contact with German agents already hiding, but when word had been passed to the Romanovs about the plan, they vetoed any thought of rescue by Germany. The Tsarina insisted, "I would rather die in Russia than be rescued by the Germans." The same fate as Stepanov's had befallen a young officer from the Imperial Guard named Captain Paul Buligan, who failed in early July 1918 in an ill-conceived mission based on a false rumor he heard the Romanovs were about to be evacuated to Kotelnik near Vyatka. Once the family arrived there, he and his fellow conspirators in the National Center planned to seize weapons from the town's small Bolshevik garrison, storm the house in which the Romanovs were being held, and take them north by river steamer to Archangel in the Arctic. When the Romanovs failed to arrive at Kotelnik and rumors began that Tsar had been murdered, Buligin decided to travel to Ekaterinburg to find out what was going on. But he arrived at the city's railway station only to be recognized by a former officer who knew him and hauled him off to jail. Here, living on salted herring and dirty bread and tortured by thirst in a cell shared with several others, he had watched in horror as night after night, one by one, his cellmates were taken away and shot. He thought his own execution inevitable when, without explanation, he was taken from the jail and back to the station under escort and put on a train full of wounded Red Army soldiers being evacuated from the Czech front. The possibility of a staged rescue from within Ekaterinburg itself was not, in fact, as unlikely as it seemed, because the military academy of the General Staff of the former Imperial Army had been evacuated to the city in April. Of its 300 officials, only a handful professed any Bolshevik sympathies, and among their ranks lurked a secret cabal of 5 monarchist officers, led by 26-year-old Captain Dmitry Malinovsky, who discussed the possibilities of rescue. With the academy located so close to the Novotikvinsky convent, approaches were made to the nuns to act as possible go-betweens. Dr. Derivenko was asked for a plan of the upper floor of the house where the Romanovs lived, which he had seen and could readily provide. With the rapid approach of the Czechs during World War I, Trotsky ordered the academy to be transferred to Kazan, but only about half of the staff left. The rest remained, declaring they were neutral. Philip Goloshkin, however, took no chances and ensured their activities were closely watched, and the academy was assigned its own political commissar, a Chekist named Matveev. Nevertheless, Malinovsky and his 4 friends continued to plot and recruited another 7 fellow officials at the academy into their scheme. But they lacked money and weapons. They could not appeal for help locally among the terrorized population, and their hopes came to nothing. In the end, although as many as 37 men from the Loyal Academy were eventually involved in a rescue plot, all they were able to do was send in gifts of food via the nuns. When the Czechs arrived at the end of July 1918, these same 37 defected to their ranks. We shall never know for sure the identity of the author of the first officer letter received by the Romanovs at the Ipatiev house on or around the 20th of June. Either it was genuine and came from Malinovsky's group and was intercepted by Avdiv, or it was the first of four deliberate fabrications by the Cheka. If it was indeed genuine, then the Cheka were quick to spot its potential as a means of testing the Romanovs' willingness to intrigue in their own escape, in Bolshevik eyes, good enough grounds for their annihilation and their supposed upcoming trial in Moscow to be headed by the Jew Lenin. So the letter was deliberately copied and amended and passed on to the family so that any written response could be intercepted. Coming as it did through the good offices of the nuns of the convent, the letter seemed trustworthy, even though it was flawed in its failure to use the correct terms of address to a Tsar by a supposed loyalist. It was nevertheless reassuring. The family's friends on the outside had not forgotten them after all. It had arrived at a time of great despondency and offered the first tangible hope of rescue after weeks of being deprived of any letters, visits, or news of the world outside. The Romanovs' friends, as the letter, written in red ink, announced portentously in French, were no longer sleeping. The hour so long awaited had come. The Bolsheviks were a clear and present danger to the family, but with the Czechs, the liberating army of Slavic friends, now only 50 miles away from Ekaterinburg, the Red Army had to fall. The family were told to listen for any movement outside, to wait and hope and be ready at any time, day or night, for liberation. They were to smuggle out in the cream bottle a map of the layout of their rooms with as much detail as possible. The note was signed, "From someone who is ready to die for you, officer of the Russian army." The family's cautious response, written in French by Olga, not the Tsarevich, who had an excellent understanding of French, in the blank space at the bottom of the letter a day or so later, warned all windows were sealed, and the Tsarevich was too sick and unable to walk. They were adamant. No risk whatsoever must be taken without being absolutely certain of the result. We are almost always under close observation. Another letter quickly followed on the 25th from the supposed loyal officer, talking of escape from one of the upstairs windows, an impossibility until, by coincidence or design, the Bolsheviks allowed a window to be unsealed and opened. A day or so later, would it be possible beforehand to tranquilize the little one in some way so that he could be lowered down without pain? The letter asked. This question is especially interesting because Dr. Derivenko may have known that Tsarina had a resource of opium, which the family took in tiny parts. That same day, the 25th, the Romanovs responded with doubt and caution, giving details of the newly opened window, the location of upstairs guards, the regular inspections, the system of alarm bells, the guards in the house across the street, the motor car always at the commandant's disposal outside. Now, too, they asked about the welfare of Dr. Botkin and their servants. What about them? It would be ignoble of us to leave them alone after they followed us into exile, the family wrote. If they were to flee and leave them behind, could they be sure nothing would happen to them? They were worried about their personal documents, letters, and diaries in storage crates in the outhouse. Nevertheless, they assured their rescuer officer, "You can count on our sang-froid." A third letter came about a day later, telling the family to prepare for a signal at night, upon which they were to barricade their door with furniture and climb out of the window by a rope, where their rescuers would be waiting at the bottom. What followed seemed an ill-thought plan which must have set the Tsar and Tsarina on their guard. 7 people, including a sick boy with a crippled leg, were somehow to come down a handmade rope or piece of laundry from the first floor to where transportation would be waiting. What about the guards who patrolled the circuit between the two palisades, and the machine gun placement on the ground floor that watched this area at all hours? Of such importance was the machine gun that it was replaced with a more advanced model halfway through the Romanovs' exile. They were highly skeptical. But on the nights of June 25th and 26th, the family sat up anxiously fully dressed, the women wearing jewels concealed in bodices, in anticipation of flight, but it did not come. The waiting and uncertainty had, wrote the Tsar in his diary, been very trying. The whole plan had suddenly seemed suspicious if not improbable, and clearly alarmed, the family responded most emphatically on June 27th in a letter written in crayon by the Tsarina. We do not want to, nor can we escape. We can only be carried off by force, just as it was force that was used to carry us from Tobolsk. Their rescuers were not to count on any active help from them, nor did they wish Avdiv and the guards who had been kind to them to suffer in any way. They were now far too closely watched. If a rescue were to be attempted, then in the name of God, avoid bloodshed above all. The following night they continued to watch and wait, but it was hopeless. Several days elapsed before a fourth and final letter arrived from the would-be rescuers, apologizing for their slow response. The changeover of commandant and guards at the house, plus the approach of the Czechs, now made things difficult. The vague promises of impending rescue seemed even more implausible now, as too did the adventure instruction to await the whistle around midnight. The Romanovs did not respond in the blank space provided, although they passed the letter back with a brief message in barely legible pencil on the envelope. Surveillance of us is constantly increasing because of the open window. They knew because on the night of the 28th they had heard the sentry on duty below being specifically instructed to watch their every move at that window. Rescue was elusive, the thought of it guaranteed only to torment and demoralize at this point, as too was the false information contained in one of the officer letters that the family's friends D. for Dolgorukov and T. Tadashchev were in safe hands. This was false. They had both already been shot. The first letter received by the family, which Avdiv claimed to have intercepted, may have been genuine. Avdiv later stated it had come from an Austrian army officer named Mahich. It is possible he was referring to Major Migic, a Serbian officer and member of the Tsar's general staff, who had come to Ekaterinburg in the entourage of Princess Helena of Serbia. When she arrived to inquire about the fate of her own husband, now at Ipatiev, as well as that of the Romanovs. Princess Helena of Serbia served alongside Princess Maria Pavlovna the Younger in World War I as a nurse, and she was incredibly patriotic. Migic was arrested along with several other members of Helena's entourage. The other three letters, supposedly passed on to the Tsarina by one of the internal guards, were probably a deliberate fabrication composed by the Cheka. They were dictated by a man called Peter Voykov, with further input from Alexander Beloborodov. Voykov was a local Bolshevik. With these letters and the Romanovs' response to them in their possession, the Ekaterinburg Bolsheviks now had a smoking gun, solid evidence of an escape plan and the family's willingness to conspire, which could be used, should they wish, to justify the murder of the family during a possible escape attempt. Yurovsky later observed that by responding to the letters, Nicholas had fallen into a hasty plan by us to trap him. It also provided a valuable lever with the Central Executive Committee in Moscow in supporting the Ural Regional Soviet's ongoing argument that, with the Czechs approaching and the continuing threat of rescue not abating, the time had come to do away with the imperial family before they fell into the wrong hands and could be used as a further political pawn. The desperate situation in Ekaterinburg was all too apparent to British Consul Thomas Preston, who on July 11th managed to get a cipher out to a colleague at the diplomatic enclave at Vologda. For 20 days, he and his fellow consuls in the city were forbidden by the Bolshevik military to send or receive telegrams. Public sympathy for the Czechs closing in on the city in a pincher movement from the south, west, and east was growing, especially since the murder of 18 hostages in the city at the end of June. Since the revolution, more than 800 local Ekaterinburg men were reluctantly mobilized for military service, but there was now considerable opposition to this in the rural districts, with recruits refusing to fight against fellow Slavs like the Czechs, nor did they want to fight in the Red Army alongside Austrian and German prisoners of war. At the Werk X works outside the city, 4,000 old soldiers from the front gathered in the public square demanding an end to military operations led by Lenin's commissars. These new men had no sympathies with the Russian laboring classes, they argued. The protesters were quickly dispersed and several arrested by the Cheka and threatened with shooting for their act of counter-revolution. As an example to the others, 5 of the protesters were taken and thrown alive into a gas hole where verified cinders was burned. Brutality such as this only further confirmed Preston's view that the Bolsheviks were now holding power exclusively by means of terrorism. In the summer of 1918, the road out to Koptyaki Forest, a dense area of ancient birch and pine forest 9 miles northwest of Ekaterinburg, takes you past struggling wooden suburbs of the low, flat city and the stinking smokestacks of the huge Werk works, along a small local road that was crossed by the rail lines to Perm and Nizhny Tagil. There was not much cause for anyone to wish to go there except to get to the small farming and fishing village of Kopyaki. There was a time when they mined for gold here, not deep mines, but shallow mines like caves. It was a dangerous place to walk. The open workings were full of fetid silt and rainwater, and beneath that, permafrost. Nevertheless, a mining technician on July 11th, Ivan Fisenko, who had been working in the area prospecting for iron ore, was idly carving his name on a tall birch tree. He was sitting not far from a spot known to the locals as the Four Brothers, because of 4 tall pine trees that had once stood there. Nearby, there were a couple of disused iron ore workings, surrounded by mounds of clay earth, not far from a small pond. Suddenly, Fisenko noticed 3 men approaching on horseback. As they came nearer, he recognized one of them immediately as Commandant Yurovsky of Ipatiev House. The other was called Ermakov from the Werk works, and the third man looked like an Austrian or Magyar prisoner of war, but it might have been former Kronstadt sailor Stepan Vaganov. Seeing Fisenko, the men stopped and asked him about the state of the road and access to the village of Koptyaki beyond. Could you get a lorry up there? They needed to transport 500 poods, about 8 tons, of grain, to the village. Fisenko told them he thought the road was good, you could get through by lorry. But as the men turned and rode off, he asked himself the question, why would they want to transport such a heavy load to such a remote spot? Back at the Ipatiev house, the guard duty book for that day was filled out, but there seemed nothing to say, except the one recurring comment of late, Vesya obshneno, everything is the same. Did King George of England abandon all hope of saving his dear cousin Nicky? As late as June 4th, 1917, he confided to his diary on hearing rumors that Nicky and Alexandra might be confined to the fortress of St. Peter and Paul in St. Petersburg, that he feared he will not come out alive. On the surface, however, the official British records were and remained silent on the matter. There is virtually no official correspondence inquiring about the plight of the Tsar and his family during the crucial period of 1917 through 1918, though it is known that Alexandra's other sister, Victoria, married to Lord Battenberg and settled on the Isle of Wight, wrote to Foreign Secretary Balfour expressing anxiety about the safety of both her sisters and suggesting mediation by neutral Sweden or Spain. If Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, a princess of Sweden had not divorced her husband, it's possible that this would have been easier. Having also spoken to George and Mary, the royal couple, privately at Buckingham Palace, Princess Victoria contacted King Alfonso of Spain. The bonds across the royal houses of Europe, populated in large part by the children and grandchildren of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, were many and complex. Privately, the King and Queen Mary, who was also now making her own personal representations to King Alfonso to intervene, may well have had a crisis of conscience. George did later, over the safety of other imperial royal relatives in Austro-Hungary and Greece. Under private pressure from his relatives, King George, in a last-minute turnaround, might have sought advice on the possibility of an unofficial rescue by British Secret Service agents, bypassing the need for government sanction and rules. Constitutional monarch he might be, but as head of the armed services he was, during the war, in regular contact with the War Office and its Secret Service. Unsubstantiated suggestions have been made by Michael Auchelshaw and by Tom Mangold and Anthony Summers that British agents had private meetings with the king in the spring of 1918, at which plans for a rescue were discussed. This might explain a telegraph sent via the Foreign Office in May 1918 to Bruce Lockhart, a British agent based at the British Embassy in Moscow, which in rather formal, veiled terms observed the king is greatly distressed by the reports which have reached him about the family's treatment in Tobolsk, and that if it were generally believed here they were victims of unnecessary cruelty, the impression produced would be most painful. One could argue that perhaps King George's attacks of guilt came after he knew the Romanovs had been murdered, and he did not do enough to stop it. It was left to the intelligence service's discretion to judge whether rescue might be viable. To do so publicly would risk not just failure, but with it dangerous embarrassment to the king and the British government, as well as their deep contacts into banking and the bankrollers of the Bolshevik Revolution. As late as November-December 1917, evidence in Canadian archives shows that money had been spent by the British in commissioning the Hudson's Bay Company at Murmansk to construct a house to accommodate the Romanov family on land near the British consulate, should their evacuation out of Russia via the Arctic eventually be effected, suggesting that private attempts under the control of the British military or Secret Service to get the Romanovs out of Russia were ongoing. Hudson's Bay Company records show Allied intelligence operatives in Murmansk had been involved in building a house large enough to accommodate 7 people. As late as March 1918, a Hudson's Bay troubleshooter called Henry Armistead, who also worked for the British Secret Service and whose family were well-known traders in Riga, was said to have set up a Romanov rescue bid in collaboration with a Norwegian Arctic shipping merchant, Jonas Lied, aimed at getting the family out of Tobolsk via the river Yenisei in Siberia to Murmansk. The rescue plan had still been under consideration even after the family were moved to Ekaterinburg, and might explain why British agent Major Stephen Alley sent an undercover mission into the city in May to look at Ipatiev House. The rescue plan he mooted, using British agents and local Russian monarchists, had foundered because the British government would not stump up the money to fund it, an irony since the British royal family loved snapping up Romanov royal jewels, but also because the Ipatiev house proved utterly impregnable and Ali's associates in Ekaterinburg were too closely watched by the local Cheka. Despite King George's apparent withdrawal of support, diplomatic and other attempts by foreign royals to obtain asylum abroad for the Romanovs date back to the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk of March 1918, when King Christian of Denmark contacted the Kaiser, urging his intercession. They continued on into 1918 from neutral Copenhagen, the Danish royal family having very close links to the Dowager Empress Marie Ferdinand. Alexandra, the British Queen Mother, was the Dowager's sister. Their lobbying was bolstered by Alexandra's brother, Grand Duke Ernst Ludwig of Hesse, who had hosted the Grand Duchesses in their childhood, In March 1918, the Kaiser responded to King Christian's later request, stating he could well understand his concern, and in spite of all the painful things he and his people suffered at the hands of his former friends, the Romanovs, he could not but feel sympathy. However, he had to tread carefully, for any attempt he made to intercede on their behalf would be misinterpreted by the Bolsheviks as an attempt to reinstate the Tsar. For similar reasons, the Kaiser vetoed sanctuary in Germany for Grand Duke Kirill Romanov and his wife, who, after they fled to Coburg, moved to France. The Kaiser's opinion was that the best course of diplomacy lay with the neutral Nordic states, such as Sweden, where the Romanovs had a former princess. From Ekaterinburg itself, the British consul, Thomas Preston, continued to urge his Foreign Office to try and get the Romanovs out, if only to prevent them falling into German hands, where they would be a trump card for a future Germanophile monarchy orientation in Russia. The new British consul general in Petrograd, Arthur Woodhouse, argued the same. The general view among Germany's enemies was that, should the Kaiser choose to topple the Bolsheviks, which was perfectly possible in the summer of 1918, he might restore a puppet monarchy in Russia and reduce it to a German satellite state. The Germans had been very active in their demands for the Romanov safety, for very good reasons. The Kaiser had always been jealous of the close relationship between King George and Tsar Nicholas, and became even more paranoid when they became military allies against him in World War I. With the British king failing to intercede on his cousin's behalf, it would have been a matter of great personal satisfaction to the Kaiser to succeed where his cousin failed, particularly because he believed the British connived in the Tsar's overthrow in the first place in order to prevent him making peace with Germany, and so he could now be the peacemaker. In exile in the 1930s, having now also lost his own throne, Kaiser Wilhelm continued to take the moral high ground, confiding to his old friend General Walscart Waters his readiness to help the Tsar in 1917 and 1918, having ordered the German Chancellor von Bethmann and his ambassador to Russia, Count Mirbach, to press the Bolsheviks hard over the issue. Prior to his murder on July 6, 1918, Mirbach repeatedly assured Russian monarchists the Germans had the Romanov situation in hand. And then he was shot. He had been in regular contact with the Council of People's Commissars, reiterating to them on May 10th the expectation that the German princesses would be treated with all possible consideration. He assured the Romanovs' anxious relatives that the family remained under their protection, and that when the time comes, the imperial German government will take the necessary measures. What if the Kaiser had succeeded and had enabled the strengthening of Europe through these familial bonds? The Bolsheviks would have had a really hard time clawing back. Kaiser Wilhelm had certainly given his blessing to the British offer of safe passage by sea to England, and ordered his navy and army not to hinder such an evacuation. Indeed, Tsar Nicholas II hoped that he would be able to move to England to start a farm. By the summer of 1918, with the British king out of the picture, the Germans alone, it would seem, were the only ones in a position to save the imperial family while they were at war with Russia. Rumors abounded under the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk that a secret codicil guaranteed the Romanovs would be handed over to the Germans. The problem was the Tsar and Tsarina would not be saved by Germany at any price. The press had associated the Tsarina with Germany for years and dragged her for it. With the family now in Ekaterinburg, such German intentions that remained were no longer to do with saving the Tsar, with whom the Kaiser always had an uneasy relationship, in part because their links were by marriage rather than blood. The fate of the Tsar was now a matter for the Russian people. In the end, what counted were the chivalric impulses the Kaiser still nursed to do right by his own kin, Alexandra and her sister Ella, a favorite of the Kaiser's, both of the House of Hesse, and by association the four Romanov daughters. The question of Alexei Tsarevich and heir to the Romanov throne was again politically sensitive. Nor were the imperial family the only German royals in Russia to whom the Kaiser wanted to extend protection. Maria, the widow of Grand Duke Vladimir, a princess of the House of Mecklenburg, and Elizaveta, the widow of Grand Duke Constantine, a princess of the House of Saxe-Altenburg, were both still in Russia, and the three sons of Constantine and Elizaveta, the children of a German mother just like the Romanov children, had now been incarcerated. In May 1918, the sense of urgency increased because Czech legions loyal to Germany were advancing on Ekaterinburg after false reports circulated in June of the Tsar's death, reports taken over by the mainstream media to continue confusion among Europe. After Murbach's murder, his replacement, Dr. Kurt Riesler, was officially designated to keep up the pressure on the Bolsheviks, but during crucial July days he was sick, and it was impossible for the German government to gain any independent information about the situation at Ipatiev House, they, like everybody else, being at the mercy of the web of disinformation spun by the Bolsheviks and their willing spies and journalists. Behind the scenes, German agents, convinced Lenin's government was moribund, continued to associate with monarchists in fomenting a counter-revolution in Russia. But if the Kaiser had given up on the Romanovs, agreeing voluntarily to accept German asylum, only one option now lay open to him if he was not to lose face, and be seen to be abandoning his relatives, their abduction against their will. We have to ask ourselves, why did all of the pressure fall to the German royal family when the British royal family was just as closely connected to the Tsar and an ally to Russia during World War I? Rumor has it the Swiss section of the League for the Restoration of the Russian Empire was approached in June with a plan hatched in Berlin to kidnap the Tsar and bring him to Germany. German intelligence operatives were active across the Urals, and others were based in Ekaterinburg at the time under the guise of a Red Cross mission. But no conclusive evidence has come to light indicating any viable German plans for a last-ditch rescue. We also have to remember the reputation that Tsarina had across Europe at the time, as she was blamed for Rasputin's interference in Russian affairs, and she did not have a great reputation among many of her relatives. In the end, all the various royal initiatives to free the Romanovs were stymied by a lack of will, disunity, international politics, the war, a conflict of political loyalties, a lack of information. The official German archives on the Romanov matter are, like the British ones, almost silent about the real role of the Kaiser. The Danish archives have yet to reveal any role their royal family played in the scenario. Same with the Swedish archives. Whatever these final initiatives might have been, it was a case of too little too late. The inability of foreign governments to unite and take concerted action over a humanist matter, the fate of the Romanovs, played straight into the hands of the bloody Bolsheviks, making them all ultimately the dupes of Bolshevik double talk, fraud, and phony reassurances. In the midst of this, the imperial family were reduced to the status of helpless pawns in a political game that took no account of their personal fate as human beings, but only of the bigger political picture, which we see happen again and again, namely in Gaza and Syria today. Assistant British Consul Arthur Thomas was shot at on July 16, 1918, indicating the danger of being associated with these plots at all. Yurovsky managed to obtain 17 murderers in July 1918. He had been given the go-ahead from the Jew Lenin, and the Bolsheviks thought Ekaterinburg would fall in 3 days by this time. Of the Romanovs, if the Romanovs came into the hands of the Czechs, they became a political pawn for the Germans at the close of World War I. This interfered with the Bolshevik plan to expand communism into Germany, which was done via the Weimar Republic and stopped via one Adolf Hitler. Of the 17 would-be Romanov murderers, many of which are still unknown, 9 dropped out, unable to stomach the reality of shooting the Grand Duchesses. These girls seemed to know much more than their parents, and delayed getting ready by 40 minutes when ordered to the cellar of Ipatiev House on that fateful day. English was spoken among them, despite strict Russian being the rule in Ipatiev House. What did they say to each other? Was this one last communication to escape? was Grand Duchess Maria, who did not wear a jeweled cap unlike her siblings, told to charge the door behind them, which she did when the shooting started. The Fiat truck sent to haul the bodies was also interestingly sent to the wrong place. It was also too small to hold all 11 bodies of the Romanovs and their household. Was this purposeful? Did the Romanovs have a friend in the Cheka who wanted to disrupt the Bolsheviks' plans by any means possible? When the family was shot, the Tsar first, due to the overwhelming greed of the assassins to be the one to end him, smoke rapidly filled the room as well as broken plaster, and the shooting had to stop. This pause has given rise to many theories that one of the Romanovs managed to push past the guards and escape. But we know from DNA evidence that this did not happen.